Messiah Harrington was 45 years old, and he believed, the way a man believes in gravity, in God, in the ground beneath his feet, that he knew exactly who was loyal to him. He was wrong. In 17 years of marriage, he had built a $28 million real estate company from nothing but grit and a dream born on the cracked sidewalks of Third Ward, Houston. He had given his family a 10-room mansion in Memorial. He had given his son a future with no ceiling. He had given his wife a name people respected when she walked into a room. But on the night his Mercedes GLE blew a tire on the Katy freeway in a violent November rainstorm, everything he thought he knew began to unravel. The crash was minor. The head injury was real. And what Messiah whispered to Dr. Amara Grant inside Memorial Hermann Hospital, 40 minutes after regaining consciousness, was the most deliberate thing he had ever done in his life. Let them think I've forgotten everything. I need to know who loves Messiah from Third Ward, not the man who signs the checks. It is Tuesday, November 4th, 2025. The Katy freeway is slick and black under driving rain. Messiah is heading home from a late site meeting on the energy corridor. The radio is low. Some old gospel station out of Humble, Texas. Outside, the city lights smear against the wet glass. He is tired. Not sleepy tired. Soul tired. He is thinking about Brielle. Not in any particular way. Just the way you think about a room you used to love but somehow stopped visiting. She sits at the kitchen island at 5 in the morning, tablet propped up, doing something quiet and important while the house sleeps. He has seen that image 1,000 mornings and kissed the top of her head and kept walking every single time. He wonders, briefly, when he stopped asking what she was working on. Then the rear tire blows. The Glee lurches hard to the right. He grips the wheel with both hands and rides the shoulder to a stop. His chest is hammering. He exhales once and reaches for his phone. That is the last thing he remembers before his head meets the steering column. Memorial Hermann Hospital, Texas Medical Center. The room smells like antiseptic and recycled air. An IV drips a slow rhythm into his left arm. Through the window, the Houston skyline glows pale amber behind the rain. Dr. Amara Grant stands at the foot of the bed. She has known Messiah since they both carried backpacks at Texas Southern University, and she has never seen him look quite like this. Amara, barely above a whisper. I need a favor. You have a mild concussion. You're fortunate that's let them think I lost my memory. All of it. 17 years. Hidden cameras. Observation only. No interference. He holds her gaze. I need to know who walks through that door worried about me. And who's worried about the money? She sets down her clipboard. 2 weeks maximum, and if your condition changes, we tell the truth immediately. He nods once. His eyes go distant, glassy, unfocused, empty. Messiah Harrington lay perfectly still and waited. He was about to discover the most important truths of his life. And some of them were going to break him completely. Stay with me. Because the very first person who walked through that hospital door wasn't who Messiah expected. And what they did in the next 24 hours changed everything. Picture this. You are lying completely still in a hospital bed. You can hear everything. You can see everything through half-closed eyes. But you cannot react. Not to a single word. You have to keep your face smooth and empty while the people who claim to love you walk through the door one by one and show you exactly who they are. That is what Messiah Harrington did for 5 days. Deshawn arrived first, Messiah's cousin. 38 years old, with the build of a man who used to be athletic and had let it go soft. He walked in carrying takeout from a Papado on Westheimer, Messiah's favorite, wearing an expression of such practiced grief that a stranger might have wept at the sight of it. He sat beside the bed, patted Messiah's hand gently, and said, "Cuz, I'm here. Whatever you need. And don't you worry. My wife and we're going to make sure everything stays in order while you recover." Then he pulled out his phone and live-streamed himself doing it. "Praying for my cousin, y'all. Family first, always. Drop a heart if you're sending love to the Harrington family." 300 hearts in under a minute. Deshawn smiled softly at the screen, humble, grieving, devoted, while Messiah lay 3 feet away, perfectly still, watching through half-closed eyes. Later that same afternoon, when the nurse stepped out, Deshawn reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. A company transfer form, 40% of Harrington Empire, to be signed over in the event of permanent cognitive incapacitation. He placed it on the bedside table quietly, almost casually, like a man who had been carrying it in his coat pocket for a while and had simply been waiting for the right moment. Tyrone came that evening with brisket and dirty rice from a little place on Alameda Road. He cried convincingly. Messiah would give in that. But between the tears, he leaned close and murmured that it might be wise to move some liquid assets somewhere safe before the company lawyers arrived. "Just protecting the family," he said. Messiah lay still and thought, "I co-signed your car note in 2019. I sent money for your mother's funeral flowers." He did not blink. Zion came the second morning. 17 years old, long and lean, all arms and legs, with his father's jawline and his mother's eyes. He came through the door at a near run and pressed himself against his father's chest with the sob of someone much younger than 17, small and terrified underneath all that height. He sat for a long time afterward, holding his father's hand. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't talk about money or logistics or what came next. He just sat there, occasionally squeezing Messiah's fingers, talking quietly about small things. A basketball game. Something funny the neighbor's dog had done that morning. A song he'd been playing on repeat. He was still sitting there, still holding his father's hand, when Deshawn appeared in the doorway. "Zion, you're the man of the house now. You need to start thinking about family responsibilities." Something flickered across the boy's young face. Uncertainty, unease. The look of a 17-year-old being asked to carry a weight that was never meant for him. Messiah lay still and quietly resolved that this would not happen again. Mama Essie said nothing. She sat in the corner chair, small, straight-backed, near the window, dressed in her navy house dress and her good pearl earrings, which meant she had dressed deliberately, which meant she understood this was not an ordinary hospital visit. She watched Deshawn. She watched the document on the bedside table. She watched Tyrone's performance with eyes that had been reading people for 68 years and had never once been fooled for long. She said nothing, but she missed absolutely nothing. Then Brielle walked in on the second evening, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, the way the air shifts just before rain, something softening, something that makes you exhale without quite knowing why. She was wearing the old gray hoodie Messiah had given her back in 2018. Houston Rockets, faded soft from years of washing, the drawstrings long gone. No jewelry, no makeup. Her eyes were swollen, the way eyes get only from crying through the night when you were too proud to let anyone watch. She sat beside him, took his hand in both of hers, and held it. She did not mention the company, did not ask about insurance, accounts, or lawyers. She leaned forward and said softly, "Do you remember the time you spilled sweet tea all over my white dress at Third Ward Baptist?" Pastor Williams was trying not to laugh the entire service. She smiled at the memory, a real smile, not a performed one, with real sadness right behind it. She told him about the chicken soup he'd attempted when she caught a bad flu the first winter after Zion was born. Thin as water, under-seasoned, with something floating in it that might have been celery, or might have been a kitchen experiment gone sideways. She laughed softly, telling it. She wiped the sweat from his forehead with a cool cloth. She smoothed the blanket. She sang, barely above a whisper, "His eye is on the sparrow," the way women in their family had always sung it, quietly, without apology, because it was true and because it helped. She kept doing this for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the third night, Messiah heard the nurse mention that Mrs. Harrington had settled the hospital bill in full, in cash. He looked at her left hand the next morning. Her diamond wedding ring was gone. She noticed him looking. She tucked her hand gently beneath the edge of the blanket and smiled at him, calm, unbothered, as if nothing in the world was out of place. She had sold her ring quietly in the middle of the night to pay his medical bills. She had told no one. She had come back to his room, sat down beside him, and picked up right where she left off, telling stories and smoothing blankets and singing low. 2 tears rolled silently from the corners of Messiah's eyes and disappeared into the pillow. For the first time in a very long time, he asked himself a question he had no good answer for. How many moments like this did I walk right past? Before we go further, here is a question for everyone watching. If the person who loved you most had been quietly carrying something this heavy, would you have noticed? Or would you have kissed them on the head and kept walking? Drop your answer below. 2 or 3 words, or your whole story, either one. It was past midnight when Messiah heard them. 2 voices, low and deliberate, just beyond the half-open door. The hallway light threw a narrow yellow stripe across the floor. If she signs the paperwork now, she gets half of everything, before the company lawyers can move. Messiah did not shift, did not change his breathing. He stared at the ceiling and let the words settle into him like stones into still water. They had already calculated the split. They were discussing his wife and his life's work, the way men divide a restaurant check at the end of a dinner they had no intention of paying for. He lay still, and for the first time since the accident, grief inside him sharpened into something cold and focused, the clarity of a man who is done being patient. Deshawn had not always been this person. Years earlier, he had genuinely loved Messiah, had once stepped into a street fight to pull him out when he was badly outnumbered. But in the years since, as Messiah rose and Deshawn stayed still, something had quietly corroded. Gambling debt, financial dependency, a growing internal narrative. I was there first. I deserve more of this. Psychologists call this moral licensing, the unconscious belief that a past good act creates permission for a future harmful one. Left unexamined, that distorted logic had bent year by year into something capable of standing in a parking lot and spending 90 seconds at the rear tire of a friend's car. The most dangerous people in our lives are rarely strangers. They are the ones who once loved us and then quietly stopped. Doctor. Amara came to his bedside on the 4th morning with the expression of a woman who has held something back for as long as she responsibly can. In 2022, Harrington Empire had come to the edge of collapse. A combination of rising interest rates and 3 failed development deals near Spring, Texas, had left the company hemorrhaging cash, with the banks watching in cold silence. What saved the company was a wire transfer, $140,000, sent anonymously to the operating account on a Thursday morning in April. It was Brielle's inheritance, her grandmother's life savings, passed down to her granddaughter as the only thing in her life that had come entirely from her own family's hands. She had liquidated it without hesitation, transferred it without telling a soul, not Messiah, not her sister Keisha, not anyone, and then sat back down at her kitchen island with her cold coffee and kept going. She hid it from Messiah because she understood the weight he was already carrying. The constant financial pressure from relatives and community members who had come to treat his success as a communal resource. What many families know as the burden of always being the one others draw from, regardless of how much is left. Adding her own sacrifice to his awareness felt to her like one more burden she could spare him. She hid it from Keisha because she knew her sister would make it complicated, would assign it a price, would count the cost aloud in ways that Brielle was not willing to do. So she simply did it, and kept going, and never counted the cost aloud herself. This is what psychologists who study long-term relationships identify as invisible labor, the ongoing, uncelebrated work of one partner to hold the household, the finances, and the emotional foundation together, without acknowledgement and often without expectation of it. The tragedy of invisible labor is not that it goes unappreciated in the moment. It is that, carried in silence long enough, it becomes its own kind of loneliness. I did something enormous for you. You don't know it happened. I will do it again tomorrow, and you still won't know. Brielle had not hidden the $140,000 out of deception. She had hidden it out of a specific, self-erasing form of love, the kind that says, your burden is already too heavy. I will carry this part quietly so you never have to feel it. That is not weakness. Researchers describe it as protective self-sacrifice, a pattern common in devoted partners who fear that asking for acknowledgement will only deepen their partner's stress. The tragedy is not that she gave. The tragedy is that she gave in silence, year after year, until the silence became the entire shape of the marriage. When Dr. Amara finished speaking, Messiah sat with that information inside his chest for a long moment. He thought about Brielle at the kitchen island at 5 a.m, the cold coffee, the dark circles under her eyes that he had registered and filed away, and never once asked about. The way she always seemed to be managing some quiet, ongoing project of keeping their world intact, while he moved through their home in his good suits, thinking about square footage and acquisition timelines. Every single morning he had kissed the top of her head and kept walking. He pressed his fist to his mouth and stared at the hospital wall. There was one more thing Dr. Amara had to show him. Security footage from the parking lot of Third Ward Baptist Church. Grainy, time-stamped, the kind churches keep more for liability than surveillance. 3 days before the accident, late afternoon, lot mostly empty, November light already going thin. A man crouched at the rear driver's side tire of a black Mercedes GLE. 90 seconds, something kept low and quick, then stood, looked once over his shoulder, and walked away without looking back. It was Deshawn. Messiah watched the footage twice on the tablet Dr. Amara held at the bedside. He said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, almost to himself, he said, "My wife was protecting everything I built, and I never even knew she needed protecting herself." He handed the tablet back and breathed slowly, deliberately, the breath of a man choosing not to become the thing he is looking at. Meanwhile, down the hall in the family consultation room, something else was happening. Deshawn and Tyrone had cornered Brielle with a stack of documents, transfer forms and restructuring agreements that would shift controlling interest in Harrington Empire into a so-called family trust, managed through a small law firm on Westheimer Road. Deshawn used his reasonable voice, warm, slow, deeply concerned. "Brielle, you have to think about the future. You have to protect the family." Brielle looked at the papers. She was exhausted. She had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 5 days. Her left hand was bare. Her face showed the specific tiredness of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for much longer than the people in the room understand. She picked up the documents. She read them. Then she pushed them back across the table without a word. Deshawn slid them toward her again. This is a well-documented pressure tactic, what behavioral researchers call the foot-in-the-door method. Repeat a demand after a soft refusal, banking on exhaustion to erode a person's resistance. It works on people who are depleted, people who want the conflict to end, people who have been conditioned to believe that persistence means legitimacy. It did not work on Brielle. She stood up, and when she spoke, her voice was not raised. It was not shaking. It was the quietest, most absolute sound anyone in that room had ever heard from her. I would sleep on a hospital floor for the rest of my life before I let either of you touch what Messiah built with his hands in Third Ward. This is not just money. This is his dream, his work, his life. She turned and walked out, left the papers on the table, left two grown men sitting in stunned silence, staring at an empty doorway. She had also, without either of them noticing, pressed record on her phone the moment she walked in. She had captured every word. Back in the dark of his room, Messiah watched the consultation room footage on Dr. Amara's tablet. Alone, the door closed. And he came apart. Not quietly, not with polite, composable tears. He pressed both hands over his face and wept the way a man weeps when he has finally understood the true size of what he owes, and knows there is no fast way to repay it. Psychologists who study relational repair speak of a concept called the moment of recognition, the specific instant in which a person truly sees, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what their partner has been carrying alone. It is described as both devastating and necessary. Devastating because it forces the full acknowledgement of failure. Necessary because without it, no genuine repair is ever possible. This was Messiah's moment of recognition, the person he had underestimated the longest, the person who had guarded everything he built, quietly and without credit, long before he understood he needed guarding. She had been the strongest person in their marriage all along. He had simply been too focused on moving forward to see her standing beside him. But the deepest truth had not yet surfaced. A secret Brielle had kept even more carefully than the money, even more carefully than the recording. And when it came to light, it would bring Messiah completely to his knees. There is a particular kind of pain that only arrives when you finally see something clearly that you should have seen years ago. Not the sharp pain of a sudden shock, something slower, more like standing in a room you have walked through 1,000 times and realizing all at once that the walls have been quietly closing in, and someone you loved was holding them back with her bare hands every single day without ever once asking you to notice. That was the pain waiting for Messiah on the fourth morning. Dr. Amara came in early, before the family arrived, before the lawyers, before the day's noise began. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and told him about Marcus Webb. Houston oil money, 49 years old. The kind of man who owned a private suite at NRG Stadium and a waterfront property in Galveston, and understood, with the instincts of someone who had spent decades in rooms where deals are made, exactly how to make a lonely woman feel genuinely seen. He had entered Brielle's life 2 years earlier, at a charity gala held at the George R. Brown Convention Center downtown. Brielle had attended alone. Messiah had a site meeting in Katy that evening that he had chosen not to reschedule. Webb had been charming and unhurried, and interested in what she was actually saying, in the specific way that Messiah, somewhere across the years, had quietly stopped being. He pursued her for 4 months. Phone calls she didn't return, at length. Invitations to dinner at Brennan's of Houston that she declined. A standing offer of stability, attention, and presence. The exact things that had gone missing from her marriage, so gradually she had almost stopped noticing their absence. When Webb finally asked her directly why she would not take the door he was holding open, she gave him 8 words. "I can't leave him, even when he's lost his way." From the perspective of someone observing this marriage from the outside, Brielle's response to Webb reveals something that behavioral science can help us understand. What she was doing, staying inside a marriage that had grown emotionally empty, declining a comfortable exit, continuing to sacrifice without acknowledgement, is not simply loyalty in the conventional sense. Psychologists who study long-term relationships describe it through the lens of attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by researchers like Dr. Sue Johnson. The core finding is this: the emotional bonds we form with our closest partners do not dissolve simply because the relationship has become painful. In fact, prolonged emotional distance from an attachment figure can intensify the bond rather than weaken it. It creates what researchers describe as an internal drive to stay, to repair, to wait, because leaving feels like severing something structural, something that goes deeper than a marriage certificate. Brielle was not staying out of passivity. She was not staying out of fear. She was staying because, at the deepest level of how she was wired to love, Messiah was still her person, even the version of him she could barely find anymore. And here is the observation that an outside eye would recognize most clearly. Messiah's increasing emotional withdrawal had not made Brielle give less. It had made her give more. His absence had not created distance in her. It had activated her deepest instinct to close the gap. She kept sacrificing, kept protecting, kept quietly filling in the spaces he left behind. He had read her steadiness as contentment. It was not contentment. It was a devoted woman running on empty, convinced that if she just held on long enough, he would find his way back. This is one of the most painful patterns in a failing marriage, invisible from the inside, heartbreakingly clear from without. 2 good people, each suffering in silence, neither able to translate what they needed into words the other could hear. Then Keisha came, Brielle's younger sister, 39, practical, with the particular directness of a woman who has spent years watching someone she loves absorb more than any person should absorb quietly. She sat down across from Dr. Amara and looked at Messiah with the expression of someone who has decided that protecting him from information is no longer an act of kindness. "Brielle's heart," she said. For 2 years, Brielle had been living with a serious cardiac condition, an arrhythmia that had progressed, quietly and steadily, the way medical conditions progress when they are consistently deprioritized. There had been episodes of chest pain, sharp, sudden, the kind that stopped her mid-movement and forced her to grip the nearest surface until it passed. There had been 2 separate medical emergencies. Both times she had recovered before Messiah was aware anything had happened, and both times she had chosen, deliberately, not to tell him. The surgery she needed was expensive, not impossible for a woman of her household's income. But Brielle had not drawn from the household accounts for personal use in 3 years. She had her own account, modest compared to what surrounded her, and she had quietly directed it elsewhere. The scholarship fund, her grandmother's community program, the anonymous transfer that had saved the company in 2022. By the time her doctors had given her a clear timeline for intervention, the account held almost nothing. She had postponed the surgery, then postponed it again. When Keisha had confronted her in the kitchen, standing across the granite island, voice low and furious, Brielle had looked at her sister with complete calm and said, "The scholarship children need those books. Things will settle down, and then I'll take care of my heart." Keisha's voice cracked as she finished the story. "She nearly died twice, Messiah. Twice. While you were building the next floor of a company she had already helped save." What Brielle was doing has a name in clinical psychology: self-silencing. Research by Dr. Dana Jack identified it as one of the most damaging patterns a devoted partner can fall into over time. It begins genuinely. If I name what I need, I will burden him further. If I ask for help, I add to his pressure. But over time, it becomes reflexive, automatic. The person stops registering their own needs as valid. They begin to treat themselves as the one variable in the household that can always be deferred, rescheduled, addressed later. The outside observer sees clearly what the person inside the marriage cannot. This is not strength. It is a slow and steady act of self-erasure, performed in the name of love by someone who no longer believes her own needs belong on the list. And Messiah? It must be said honestly, because this story asks for honesty, was not a villain. He was a man trapped in his own psychological pattern, the belief deeply held by men who grew up with very little that providing financially is the fullest and most legitimate expression of love. That as long as the mortgage is paid, the company is growing, and the family has what it needs materially, love has been demonstrated. Psychologists call this provider identity fusion. When a person's sense of love and worth becomes so completely entangled with their financial role that they lose access to every other way of being present. Messiah had not stopped loving his family. He had simply stopped knowing how to love them in any language but money. Two people, two silences, neither one reaching across the space between them. On the fifth morning, the room was full. Family, lawyers, the pastor from Third Ward Baptist, Mama Essie in her corner chair, unchanged and watchful. Messiah sat up in the bed, slowly, deliberately, the movement of a man returning to himself after a long absence. His voice was rough from days of near silence, but his eyes were clear. Brielle. She was standing near the window. She turned, and something in the way he said her name, not distant, not empty, but fully present and directed at her, made her expression open the way a door opens after a long time locked. I remember everything. The room went completely still. He apologized, not briefly, not abstractly. He named specific failures, the birthdays he had missed, the mornings he had walked past her at that island without asking, the 3 years of letting her carry everything while he told himself he was doing it all for the family. He spoke for several minutes, and he did not qualify a single word of it. Research in couples therapy, particularly Dr. John Gottman's work at the University of Washington, consistently shows that genuine repair requires this kind of specificity. A general apology signals awareness. A specific one signals that you have actually seen the person, not a version of them, but them, in their particular daily reality. That distinction is the difference between an apology that closes a wound and one that merely acknowledges it exists. Brielle was crying before he finished, openly, fully, her whole body releasing something she had held compressed for a very long time. She told him about the night she had drafted documents to legally end the marriage, 8 months earlier. She had sat at the kitchen island at 5 a.m, written everything out, read it twice, and then folded the pages and burned them in the kitchen sink and watched the ash go cold. Because she still loved him. Because she still believed he was worth walking back to. Then Messiah pressed play on his phone. Deshawn's voice filled the room. Every whispered plan, every calculated suggestion, every word spoken in that hospital hallway past midnight. Clear, unmistakable, and damning. Mama Essie rose from her corner chair, 68 years old, with the moral authority of a woman who has seen enough of life to know exactly where a line is and what it means to cross it. She looked at Deshawn. She looked at Tyrone. She pointed toward the door. Neither man argued. Neither man spoke. They left. But Deshawn stopped in the hallway. And then, in a final act of desperation, he turned around, came back through the door, and exposed Brielle's medical condition in front of everyone in the room. The shock registered on Brielle's face before she could stop it. Her hand went to her chest. Her knees buckled. Messiah was across the room before she could fall, both arms around her, holding her against him while her heart responded to the sudden surge of stress and exposure. He held her there, in the middle of the room, in front of lawyers and family, and the pastor who had known them both since the early days, and he said, his voice completely broken, "My wife, you put your life on the line to protect mine, and I was the one wearing a mask this whole time, not you, never you." The room held its breath. Not one person moved. Because the woman everyone had long assumed was the quiet, steady, uncomplicated presence in that marriage had been the strongest person in the room all along. And now, at last, everyone in it could see that clearly. With every mask finally removed and every silence finally broken, only one question remained, and it was the most important one either of them had ever faced. Was what remained between them strong enough to rebuild into something real? There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a storm. Not peaceful exactly. More like the quiet of a house after the furniture has been rearranged. Familiar shapes in new positions. The same rooms somehow larger. The same air somehow different. You move through it carefully at first. You keep expecting to bump into the thing that used to stand in the corner. That was the Harrington household in the weeks that followed. Brielle's surgery was scheduled within 10 days of Messiah's hospital discharge. He handled every detail himself, spoke directly with the surgeon, sat with the billing office, confirmed every logistics point with the focus he had once reserved exclusively for major real estate closings. He made sure her room had good natural light. He brought her the old gray hoodie to wear home from the hospital. He sat in the surgical waiting room for 6 hours with Zion beside him, both of them watching the same set of doors without saying much. When the surgeon came out and told him the procedure had gone well, Messiah bowed his head and sat quietly for a moment. His eyes were closed. His hands were loose in his lap. Zion put a hand on his father's back. Neither of them needed to say anything. They both already knew. The legal matters resolved with less spectacle than the hospital room had suggested they might. The parking lot footage from Third Ward Baptist Church, clear, time-stamped, and unambiguous, was turned over to Houston PD, and the case moved forward with the unhurried certainty of evidence that leaves very little room for argument. Deshawn retained a lawyer from a firm on Richmond Avenue who specialized in exactly this category of situation. The consultation room recording Brielle had made handled the rest. Tyrone, confronted with the same audio and no credible alternative explanation, agreed to a civil settlement that permanently severed both men from any future connection to Harrington Empire. Messiah's attorneys, from the firm with offices downtown, made certain that severance was airtight. Mama Essie never once said, "I told you so." She didn't need to. She had the kind of face that communicated it, quietly and continuously, regardless of the occasion. The harder work was the marriage. Because a heartfelt apology in a hospital room, however sincere, cannot undo 17 years of slow drift in a single conversation. You cannot repay a $140,000 act of silent sacrifice with words alone. That is not how marriages heal. Marriages heal in the small hours, in the uncomfortable conversations, in the ordinary mornings when a person chooses to be fully present instead of retreating into distraction or habit or the comfortable numbness of avoidance. Messiah and Brielle began counseling in January. A therapist in the museum district, with a corner office that had good light and a bookshelf running the entire length of one wall. They went every week, some weeks twice. It was not a smooth process. There were sessions they both left with tight jaws and unsettled eyes, carrying things they needed to sit with alone before bringing them back. There were conversations that circled the same ground more than once before finding firmer footing. But they kept showing up. Week after week, they came back to the room and sat down across from each other. That consistency, showing up even when it was uncomfortable, choosing to remain even when retreat would have been easier, was itself the work. Messiah restructured Harrington Empire from the foundation up, the pattern of relatives and personal connections drawing from the company as though it were a family account, a pattern that had quietly drained both his finances and his emotional reserves for years, was addressed directly, without apology, but with fairness. Employees who held positions based solely on personal connection were transitioned out with reasonable severance. The organization was rebuilt around competence and accountability. In place of that old pattern, Messiah established the Harrington Third Ward Foundation, a permanent community organization funded by a percentage of the company's annual profits, dedicated to scholarships, housing assistance, and youth mentorship. Its board was composed entirely of people who lived and worked in Third Ward and understood from direct experience what the neighborhood needed. It was the kind of institution he had once talked about building someday when things settled down. He stopped waiting for things to settle down. Mama Essie, upon hearing the details, observed that it was the thing you should have done with your success 10 years ago. She said it kindly, more or less. Brielle launched her reading program. She named it Miss Ida's Library Project, after her grandmother, and anchored it at a community center on Ennis Street in Third Ward, a few blocks from where Messiah had once sold newspapers as a boy. She sourced books through donations and a small foundation grant, and she ran Saturday morning reading sessions herself, cross-legged on a rug, surrounded by children who called her Miss Brielle and treated her like a piece of the furniture they had always expected to find there. She came home from those Saturdays with paint on her hands and a tiredness that looked entirely different from the tiredness Messiah had watched gather under her eyes for years. This was the other kind, the satisfied kind, the kind that comes from pouring yourself into something that gives back. Messiah watched her one afternoon from the kitchen doorway. Still in her reading program t-shirt, laughing at something Zion had said across the counter, her surgical scar barely visible at her collar. The late afternoon light came through the window the way it does in Houston in winter, low and golden, unhurried. He thought, this is what I almost lost. Not the house, not the company, not the money. This. Zion gave a speech at Bel Air High School in February, a 5-minute class assignment, any topic. He chose the only subject that had occupied his thinking for 3 months straight. He stood at the front of the room, all 6 feet and 1 inch of him, and he said, "My dad taught me that working hard is how you love your family. But this year, he taught me something more important, that showing up is how you love your family. Real legacy isn't money. It's being present for the people who need you." His teacher emailed both parents that evening. She had been teaching for 19 years, she wrote. She had never heard a 17-year-old say something that true. Stay with me just a little longer, because what happened inside that old church in Third Ward a few months later is the part of this story that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. It was a Saturday in late April when they went back to Third Ward Baptist Church. Not for a committee meeting, not for a fundraiser or a Sunday service or any of the dozen practical reasons that had brought them through those particular doors across 17 years of marriage. They went back for each other. The sanctuary was full by mid-morning, family and friends, several people from the Third Ward Foundation, a handful of the scholarship students Brielle had been tutoring since January, fidgeting in their good clothes in the back rows. Zion sat in the front pew in his good suit, long legs stretched forward, doing his best to look composed. he mostly succeeded. Mama Essie sat beside him in her best church dress and her pearl earrings, both hands folded in her lap, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this particular morning for longer than she was going to say. The stained glass windows were doing what they do best in late April, casting long, warm bars of amber and gold across the sanctuary floor, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look chosen. Messiah stood at the front of that church and waited for his wife. He was not the same man who had driven the Katy Freeway in November. Something had shifted in him, not loudly, not all at once, but in the way that deep changes happen, gradually, and then completely. He was quieter than before, but in a different register. Not the quiet of avoidance or preoccupation, the quiet of a man who has stopped running and is finally comfortable standing still. He wore a dark suit and his good shoes, and he stood with the particular steadiness of a person who knows where he is and why he is there. When Brielle came through the side door, she paused for just a moment in the threshold, the way you pause when you step from shadow into warm light and your eyes need a second to adjust. She wore ivory, simple, elegant, entirely herself. Her grandmother's Bible was in her hands. She walked to him slowly, and the old church held its breath. Messiah went down on one knee. In his hands was a ring, her ring, not a replacement, not a new design meant to symbolize a fresh start, the same ring. The diamond band she had removed quietly in the middle of the night in a hospital room and sold without a word to anyone, because his bills needed to be paid, and that was simply what she was going to do. He had tracked it through the jeweler. Bought it back at more than 3 times what she had received for it, because certain things carry a value that has nothing to do with their market price. He had prepared something to say, had written it out, revised it, rehearsed it during the drive to the church. Standing there in front of everyone, he set all of that aside. What he said instead was this: "You are the strongest foundation I have ever stood on. I got lost somewhere between Third Ward and everything we built, and I kept losing myself a little more every year, and you stayed. You sang to me, you held my hand, you sold your ring in the middle of the night and smiled like the sun was still up." His voice broke on that last sentence, and he let it. "From this day forward, I am giving you my presence, not my income, not my ambition, not a version of me that shows up between meetings. Me. Every ordinary morning, every difficult conversation, every slow Sunday. All of it. For as long as I have." Brielle had stopped trying not to cry somewhere around the second sentence. She held out her left hand, and he slid the ring back where it had always belonged. She said, "You never truly forgot us. You were just lost for a while." She looked at him steadily, this woman who had carried so much for so long without flinching. "And I stayed because I believed you'd find your way home." Behind them, Mama Essie pressed her fingers briefly to her lips. Then she whispered, to no one in particular, "Now this is a real family." In the fellowship hall afterward, there was food and conversation and the warm, overlapping noise of people who love each other crowded into a room that is technically too small for all of them. Someone had brought sweet potato pie. Someone else had contributed banana pudding in the large ceramic bowl that appeared at every church gathering, and whose origins no one could quite trace. Zion ate a generous amount of both and declined to discuss it. Mama Essie found Messiah in a quieter corner near the window. She looked up at him the way she always did. She had to look up at most people, and it had never once diminished her standing, and put her small hand on his forearm. "You almost waited too long," she said. He nodded. "But you didn't." She held his gaze. "That's the part that matters." That evening, they sat together on the back porch of their memorial home. The old wooden swing, the one Messiah had been meaning to repair for 6 years and never had, rocked slowly in the warm April air. Houston evenings in late spring have a particular quality. The smell of cut grass and night-blooming jasmine. The sky moving through pale blue to deep gold before settling into the kind of soft crimson that only the Gulf Coast seems to produce, unhurried and generous with its last light. Messiah took out his phone once. He looked at the last remaining thread of old suspicion, a message chain he had been carrying without resolving, a small, stubborn ember of distrust he hadn't been ready to extinguish. He deleted it, put the phone back in his pocket. Brielle leaned her head against his shoulder. They listened to the swing creak. They watched the light change above the roofline. After a while, without turning to look at her, Messiah said quietly, "Thank you for not giving up on me." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for coming back." This story reminds us of something simple that long marriages can quietly bury. The people who love us most are often the ones we forget to actually look at. Not the dramatic forgetting, the daily kind, the kind where you pour 2 cups of coffee, hand one over, and walk back to your chair without once asking how they slept. If you are watching this and your person is still beside you, tonight, after dinner, before the television comes on, pull your chair a little closer and ask one specific question. Not, "How are you?" Ask something only you would know to ask. "Are you still thinking about what your sister said last week?" Or, "Did that thing at the doctor's office turn out okay?" Then put your phone face down on the table and actually listen to the answer. If your person is gone and you are carrying this story alone, find the nearest grandchild this Saturday morning, hand them a wooden spoon and something that needs stirring, and tell them one true thing about the person you loved. Not a polished memory, a real one. The kind with a little embarrassment in it, or a laugh that catches you off guard. That is how love survives, not in grand gestures, in the small, repeated choice to pay attention, before you need a hospital room to remind you why it mattered. Written from a human heart, with AI's support. This story only hopes to send you a warm message. Kindness is never wasted, and even when the world feels harsh, there is always the light of justice and beautiful things quietly returning to those who are kind. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by